My name is Evelyn Anderson. I'm 32 years old, and I found an old phone at my grandma's house with a cryptic voice message from 20 years ago that completely changed everything I thought I knew about my family. Have you ever stumbled upon something from the past that made you question your entire life? That's exactly what happened to me when I decided to visit my grandmother's house one rainy afternoon. I was feeling lost, disconnected from everything and everyone around me, and I thought maybe spending time in that old house filled with memories would help me find some clarity. Little did I know that what I was about to discover would shake the foundation of everything I believed about my family and myself. If you've ever felt like there's something missing in your story, something hidden that could explain so much, then you need to hear what happened next because this journey changed my life forever. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, I want to ask you something personal. Have you ever felt like your family was keeping secrets from you, things that shaped who you are today without you even knowing? If this resonates with you, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like because sharing these stories helps us all heal together. Your support means the world to me, and it helps me continue bringing you real, raw stories about life, family, and the secrets that bind us. Now, let me take you back to that day when everything changed, when I walked into my grandmother's attic and found something I was never supposed to find. That afternoon, I drove to Grandma Margaret's house with no real plan in mind. The house had been in our family for generations, a beautiful old Victorian home with creaky floors and rooms filled with dusty furniture and forgotten memories. My grandmother had recently moved to a care facility, and my mother asked me to help sort through some of her belongings before we decided what to do with the property. As I climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, I felt this strange pull, like something was calling me up there. The air smelled like old wood and lavender, my grandmother's favorite scent, and for a moment, I felt like a child again, exploring forbidden spaces filled with mystery and wonder. The attic was exactly how I remembered it from my childhood, cluttered with boxes, old photographs, and furniture covered in white sheets that looked like ghosts in the dim light. I started opening boxes randomly, finding old clothes, books, and trinkets that told stories of lives lived long before I was born. Then, in a small wooden box tucked behind a stack of photo albums, I found it. An old flip phone from the early 2000s, the kind with a tiny screen and physical buttons that clicked when you pressed them. My heart started racing because I recognized that phone, or at least I thought I did. It was the same model my grandmother used to carry everywhere when I was a little girl, always keeping it close like it was some kind of lifeline to something important. I held the phone in my hands, feeling its weight, and noticed it still had a charger cord wrapped around it. Out of curiosity, I plugged it into an outlet in the attic, half expecting it to be completely dead after all these years. But to my absolute shock, after a few minutes, the screen flickered to life with that familiar green glow. The battery icon showed it was charging, and my hands started trembling as I navigated through the old menu system. That's when I saw it. One unheard voice message, dated exactly 20 years ago, with a timestamp that read 11:47 p.m. on October 15th, 2005. The contact name simply said, "For when you're ready," which sent chills down my spine because who leaves a message like that? My finger hovered over the play button for what felt like an eternity. Part of me wanted to respect whatever privacy my grandmother intended, but another part of me, the part that had always felt like there was something missing in my family's story, needed to know what was on that message. I pressed play, and what I heard next would haunt me for days. It was my grandmother's voice, but younger, stronger, filled with an emotion I had never heard from her before. Raw, unfiltered pain. She said, "If you're hearing this, it means you've found what I've been hiding all these years. I'm so sorry, my dear. I'm sorry for the silence, for the distance, for all the things I couldn't tell you because I thought I was protecting you. But secrets have a way of poisoning everything they touch, and I need you to know the truth before it's too late." The message continued, and I could hear my grandmother's voice cracking with emotion as she spoke about something I never knew existed in our family history. She talked about a sister, a younger sister named Clara, who I had never heard anyone mention in my entire life. According to the message, Clara had disappeared when my grandmother was only 19 years old, vanishing without a trace after a terrible argument with their parents about a man she wanted to marry. My grandmother's voice trembled as she explained how the family decided to erase Clara from their history, removing her photographs, burning her letters, and forbidding anyone from ever speaking her name again. The pain in her words was so real, so present, that I felt tears streaming down my face as I listened to this woman I thought I knew reveal a wound that had been bleeding in silence for decades. I need you to pause for a second and think about this with me. Have you ever discovered something about your family that made you realize you've been living in a carefully constructed story? One that hid the messy, painful truth underneath? If you're feeling this connection right now, Please show your support by subscribing and hitting that like button, because these are the stories we need to share to break the cycles of silence in our families. Knowing you're here with me, listening to my journey, gives me strength to continue uncovering these difficult truths. Your engagement helps this message reach others who might be struggling with their own family secrets. So thank you for being part of this community. As the message went on, my grandmother explained that she spent her entire adult life wondering what happened to Clara, searching for answers but never finding any closure. She talked about how this loss shaped every relationship she ever had, including the one with my mother, and eventually with me. The guilt of not fighting harder for her sister, of accepting her family's decision to pretend Clara never existed, ate away at her soul year after year. She said in the message, "I became a ghost in my own life, always present but never fully there, because how could I be when half of my heart was missing?" Those words hit me like a physical blow because suddenly everything made sense. The emotional distance I always felt from my grandmother, the sadness that lived behind her eyes even during happy moments, the way she seemed to be carrying an invisible weight that no one could lift. Sitting in that dusty attic with tears streaming down my face, I started connecting dots I never knew existed. All those times my grandmother would look at me with this strange mixture of love and sorrow, all those moments when she'd start to say something important but then stop herself, all the family gatherings where there seemed to be an unspoken tension hovering in the air like smoke. Now I understood that we had all been living in the shadow of this secret, this missing piece of our family puzzle that no one was allowed to acknowledge. My mother's own emotional distance, her difficulty expressing affection, her tendency to avoid deep conversations about feelings, all of it suddenly made sense as patterns passed down through generations of women who learned to bury their pain instead of healing it. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how this hidden trauma had shaped my own life in ways I never recognized. I had always struggled with feeling truly connected to people, always keeping a part of myself locked away, always afraid that if I let anyone too close, they might discover something about me that would make them leave. Now I wondered if this fear wasn't really mine at all, but something I inherited from a grandmother who lost her sister, and a mother who grew up feeling the effects of that loss without ever knowing why. Have you ever felt like you're carrying emotions that don't quite belong to you? Pain that seems to come from somewhere deeper than your own experiences? If you're nodding your head right now, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and leave a like, because we're going to explore how to break these cycles together, how to heal wounds that started long before we were born. I sat in that attic for hours, replaying the message over and over, trying to absorb every word, every pause, every breath my grandmother took as she recorded her confession. She ended the message by saying, "I'm leaving this phone here, hidden but not lost, because I believe that when the right person finds it at the right time, they'll have the courage I never had to bring Clara back into our story. Maybe that person is you. Maybe you're the one who can finally heal what I broke." Those words felt like a sacred responsibility being placed on my shoulders, a mission I never asked for but somehow always knew was mine to complete. As the sun began to set outside the attic window, casting long shadows across the dusty floor, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to find out what happened to Clara, no matter what it took or what other secrets I might uncover along the way. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years, like someone had flipped a switch inside me and suddenly everything had direction and meaning. I made coffee, opened my laptop, and started what would become an obsessive search for any trace of Clara's existence. I began with the basics: online genealogy databases, historical records, old newspaper archives from the small town where my grandmother grew up. At first, I found nothing, which made sense given how thoroughly the family had erased her from their history. But then I discovered something interesting in a 1985 local newspaper, a small classified ad that read, "Looking for Clara Whitmore, last seen 1983, family wishes to reconnect." The ad had a phone number that was probably disconnected by now, but it proved that someone, maybe my grandmother herself, had tried to find Clara at some point. I spent the entire day digging deeper, calling county clerks' offices, searching through marriage records, death certificates, anything that might give me a clue about what happened to this woman who vanished from our family story. What struck me most during this process was how easy it is to disappear, especially back in the early 1980s before everything was digitized and interconnected. A person could simply walk away from their old life, change their name, move to a new city, and become someone completely different. The thought terrified me because it meant Clara could be anywhere, or she could have died years ago without anyone in our family ever knowing. But I refused to give up. Not when my grandmother's voice from that message kept echoing in my mind. Not when I finally understood that finding Clara wasn't just about her. It was about healing all of us. Then I had a breakthrough that changed everything. I remembered that my grandmother had an old friend named Dorothy who used to visit when I was a child, a woman with kind eyes who always brought cookies and seemed to know all the family stories. I found Dorothy's contact information through my mother, though I didn't tell her why I needed it because I wasn't ready to open this wound with my family yet. When I called Dorothy and explained what I had found, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, she said in a quiet voice, "I wondered when someone would finally ask about Clara. Your grandmother made me promise never to tell, but now that she's not herself anymore, and you found that message, maybe it's time the truth came out." Those words sent electricity through my body because I knew I was about to learn something that would change everything I thought I knew about my family. Dorothy invited me to her house the next day, a small cottage filled with plants and photographs that told stories of a life well lived. We sat in her sunroom with tea growing cold in our cups as she began to tell me the real story of what happened to Clara. She explained that Clara had fallen in love with a man named James, someone from a different social class that my great-grandparents considered completely unacceptable for their daughter. The family gave Clara an ultimatum: break up with James and forget about him, or leave the family forever. Clara, who was only 21 years old and deeply in love, chose James and walked out the door one night in October 1983, leaving behind everything she had ever known. Dorothy's eyes filled with tears as she described how my grandmother, who was closest to Clara, tried to convince their parents to forgive her, but they refused and demanded that everyone act as if Clara had never existed. Here's what I need you to understand, and this is so important for anyone dealing with family conflict or estrangement. When families choose pride over love, when they decide that being right is more important than being together, everyone loses in ways that echo through generations. If you've experienced this kind of family division, or if you're watching it happen right now in your own life, I want you to know that you're not alone, and there is a way forward. Please subscribe to this channel and give this video a like, because I'm going to show you how this story unfolds and what I learned about healing these deep family wounds. Your story matters just as much as mine, and together we can break these cycles of silence and separation that cause so much unnecessary pain. Dorothy continued her story, explaining that my grandmother secretly stayed in contact with Clara for the first few years after she left. They would meet in secret, talk on the phone when no one was around, exchange letters through Dorothy, who acted as a go-between. Clara had married James, and they had moved to Oregon where he had family and job opportunities. According to Dorothy, Clara was happy, really genuinely happy in a way that made my grandmother both joyful and heartbroken at the same time. But then something happened in 1987 that changed everything. Clara called my grandmother one night, crying, saying she was in trouble and needed help. The phone call was interrupted, the line went dead, and my grandmother never heard from Clara again. She spent years trying to find her sister, hiring private investigators, calling hospitals and police stations, but it was like Clara had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only questions and the crushing weight of guilt that my grandmother carried for the rest of her life. Armed with this new information, I booked a flight to Portland, Oregon the following week, determined to find any trace of Clara and James that might still exist after all these years. Dorothy had given me the last known address from 1987, a small town called Woodburn about 30 miles south of Portland, and some old photographs of Clara that my grandmother had secretly kept and entrusted to her friend. Looking at those photos was surreal, because Clara looked so much like me. The same green eyes, the same slight smile, the same way of tilting her head in pictures. It felt like looking at a version of myself from another timeline, a life that could have been mine if circumstances had been different. On the plane, I kept thinking about that interrupted phone call, about Clara's voice saying she was in trouble, and I felt this deep urgency to find out what happened to her, as if I could somehow go back in time and help her in that moment of crisis. When I arrived in Woodburn, I went straight to the local library and asked if they had any historical records or newspaper archives from the late 1980s. The librarian, a woman in her 60s named Patricia, was incredibly helpful and showed me how to access their digital archives. I spent hours scrolling through microfilm, searching for any mention of Clara or James, any police reports or news stories that might explain what happened. Then, just when I was about to give up for the day, I found it. A small article from September 1987 with the headline, "Local Woman Missing, Husband Under Investigation." The article described how Clara Thompson, formerly Clara Whitmore, had been reported missing by neighbors who hadn't seen her in several days. Her husband James claimed she had left him and gone back to her family on the East Coast, but police found her car abandoned at a rest stop with her purse still inside, which raised immediate suspicions. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the dial on the microfilm reader to find follow-up articles. Over the next few months in 1987, there were several more stories. Police searches, James being questioned repeatedly, Neighbors describing a turbulent relationship with loud arguments and concerns about Clara's safety. But then the articles just stopped. The story went cold and there was no resolution, no arrest, no body found, nothing. It was like the investigation just faded away, which I learned was unfortunately common in missing persons cases from that era, especially when there wasn't enough evidence to charge anyone with a crime. I sat in that library feeling absolutely gutted because this confirmed my worst fear. Something terrible had happened to Clara, and my grandmother had spent the rest of her life knowing her sister was in danger that last phone call and being powerless to save her. I wasn't ready to give up, so I went to the Woodburn Police Department the next day and asked if anyone remembered the Clara Thompson case from 1987. The young officer at the desk looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. But then an older detective walking by stopped and said, "Clara Thompson? I remember that case. I was just a rookie back then, but it's one of those that stays with you." His name was Detective Robert Morrison, now semi-retired but still consulting on cold cases, and he invited me into his office to talk. I explained who I was, showed him the photographs Dorothy had given me, and told him about my grandmother's secret relationship with Clara and that final desperate phone call. Detective Morrison listened intently, taking notes, and when I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said something that gave me chills. I always knew there was more to that story than we were able to uncover. Detective Morrison pulled out an old file box from a storage room, blowing dust off the top before opening it to reveal the original case files from Clara's disappearance. As he spread the documents across his desk, he explained that James Thompson had been their primary suspect from the beginning, but they could never gather enough evidence to charge him. James had a solid alibi for the day Clara disappeared, provided by coworkers who swore he was at work all day, and without a body or crime scene, the case eventually went cold. But here's what haunted Morrison all these years. Several of Clara's friends had told police that she was planning to leave James, that she had confided in them about emotional abuse and control, and that she was secretly saving money to escape. The abandoned car, the purse left behind, none of it fit with someone who had carefully planned to run away. And Morrison had always believed that James had somehow discovered her plan and did something terrible to prevent her from leaving. Think about this for a moment, about how many women go missing every year in situations just like Clara's, trapped in relationships they're trying to escape, and how often those cases go unsolved because of lack of evidence or resources. If this story is resonating with you, if you know someone who might be in a dangerous situation, or if you've survived something similar yourself, please hit that subscribe button and like this video, because awareness and education can save lives. By sharing these stories, we shine light on the patterns that allow these tragedies to happen, and we create a community that refuses to let people disappear and be forgotten. Your engagement with this content literally helps spread this important message to people who need to hear it. So thank you for being here and being part of this mission. Detective Morrison then told me something that made my heart race. James Thompson was still alive, living in a nursing home about 40 miles away in Salem. He was 68 years old now, suffering from early-stage dementia, but still lucid enough to have conversations. Morrison had checked on him periodically over the years, hoping that guilt or failing health might make him finally confess to what happened, but James had never wavered from his story that Clara simply left him. Morrison looked at me seriously and said, "I can't officially reopen this case without new evidence, but if you wanted to visit James and talk to him as Clara's niece, there's nothing stopping you from doing that. Sometimes people will tell family members things they'd never tell police, especially when they're facing the end of their life and thinking about their legacy." The suggestion hung in the air between us, and I knew what I had to do even though the thought terrified me. I needed to look into the eyes of the man who probably killed my great-aunt and see if I could get him to finally tell the truth. The drive to the nursing home in Salem felt like the longest 40 miles of my life, my mind racing with questions about what I would say and how I would react to seeing the man who had destroyed so many lives. The facility was a modest building with beige walls and the smell of cleaning products mixed with institutional food, the kind of place where people go to wait out their final years. I checked in at the front desk, introducing myself as a distant relative who had just learned about James and wanted to visit, which technically wasn't a lie. The nurse led me down a hallway lined with residents in wheelchairs, some watching television, others staring blankly at nothing, and I felt this overwhelming sadness thinking about how life reduces us all to these final moments. She stopped at room 147 and knocked gently before opening the door, announcing that James had a visitor. James Thompson sat in a chair by the window, a thin man with wispy gray hair and deep lines carved into his face by time and perhaps guilt. When he turned to look at me, I saw his eyes widen slightly and he whispered, "Clara?" My blood ran cold because even in his confusion, even after all these years, he saw her in my face just like everyone else had when they looked at those old photographs. I sat down across from him, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, and said gently, "No, I'm Evelyn. I'm Clara's niece, her sister Margaret's granddaughter." He stared at me for a long moment, and I watched various emotions flicker across his face: surprise, fear, sadness, and something else I couldn't quite identify. Then he said in a shaky voice, "I wondered if someone from her family would ever come looking for answers. I've been carrying this weight for so long, and I'm tired, so very tired." What happened next changed everything I thought I knew about Clara's disappearance. James began to talk, slowly at first, then with increasing urgency, as if the words had been trapped inside him for decades and were finally breaking free. He told me that Clara had been planning to leave him, that he had found her secret bank account and her packed suitcase hidden in the garage. He admitted they had a terrible fight that September day in 1987, screaming at each other, saying things that could never be taken back. But then his story took a turn I never expected. He said Clara left in her car that night, driving away while he stood in the driveway, watching her taillights disappear into the darkness. He swore he never saw her again after that moment, that he had no idea what happened to her after she drove away. He said the reason he told police she went back to her family was because that's what she told him during the fight, that she was going home to the people who actually loved her. James's hands trembled as he continued his story, tears streaming down his weathered face as he explained what the police investigation had done to his life. He said that everyone assumed he was guilty, that his neighbors stopped talking to him, that he lost his job because of the suspicion and publicity, and that he spent the next 38 years living under a cloud of accusation for a crime he swore he didn't commit. He looked at me with desperate eyes and said, "I loved Clara. I really did. But I was young and stupid, and I didn't know how to love her the right way. I tried to control her because I was afraid of losing her. And in the end, my fear pushed her away just like I always knew it would. But I didn't hurt her, I swear on everything holy. I didn't hurt her." I sat there feeling completely disoriented because I had come expecting to confront a murderer, but instead I was listening to a broken old man who might actually be telling the truth. I need you to stay with me here because this is where the story gets really complicated, where nothing is as simple as good versus evil or victim versus villain. If you've made it this far in my journey, I want to ask you to please subscribe and hit that like button, because what I'm about to share next will challenge everything you think you know about seeking truth and finding closure. Sometimes the answers we find aren't the ones we expected, and sometimes justice looks different than we imagined it would. Your support helps me continue sharing these complex, messy, real stories that don't fit into neat categories, stories that reflect the actual complicated nature of human relationships and family trauma. After talking with James for nearly 2 hours, I left the nursing home with more questions than answers, my head spinning with the possibility that maybe, just maybe, Clara actually did drive away that night, and something else happened to her. I went back to Detective Morrison and told him everything James had said, watching his face carefully as he processed this information. Morrison was quiet for a long time before he finally spoke. "You know, there was always one piece of evidence that didn't quite fit the theory that James killed her. Her car was found 120 miles away from their house, at a rest stop heading east toward Idaho, not west toward California where her family lived. If James had staged her disappearance, why would he drive her car in the wrong direction?" That observation hit me like a lightning bolt because it meant there was a whole other possibility we hadn't fully explored. What if Clara really did leave that night, planning to disappear and start over somewhere new, but something went wrong on her journey? Detective Morrison and I spent the next several hours going through the old case files with fresh eyes, looking at Clara's disappearance from this new angle. He showed me the original police reports from the rest stop where her car was found, and one detail jumped out at me that apparently hadn't seemed significant at the time. A truck driver had reported seeing a woman matching Clara's description talking to someone in the parking lot around midnight, but he couldn't provide many details because it was dark and he was focused on getting back on the road. The truck driver had mentioned that the woman seemed animated, not distressed, like she was having a normal conversation with someone she knew. Morrison pulled up a map and traced the route from Woodburn to that rest stop, explaining that it would have taken Clara about 2 hours to drive there, which matched the timeline of when neighbors reported hearing the fight and seeing her drive away. We started researching missing persons cases from that same time period along that corridor, wondering if there might be a pattern we were missing, some predator or dangerous situation that could explain what happened to Clara after she left that rest stop. What we found was sobering. In 1987 alone, there were dozens of unsolved missing persons cases along major highways in the Pacific Northwest, many of them women traveling alone. The infrastructure for tracking these cases wasn't what it is today. There was no national database, no Amber Alert system, no cell phones to track someone's last location. A person could literally vanish between one town and the next, and unless someone was actively looking for them in that specific area, they might never be found. I felt this overwhelming sense of helplessness thinking about Clara out there somewhere, alone and vulnerable, while her family had already erased her from their history and her husband was being investigated as a suspect. Then Morrison suggested something that gave me a glimmer of hope. We could submit Clara's information to the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, a database that matches missing persons with unidentified remains found across the country. He explained that advances in DNA technology meant that even if remains had been found decades ago, they could potentially be identified now through genetic matching. I immediately agreed and provided a DNA sample so they could compare it against any unidentified remains in the system. Morrison warned me that this could take months and might not lead anywhere, but at least we were doing something active, something that might finally give my grandmother and our whole family the closure we desperately needed. As I left the police station that day, I felt this strange mixture of hope and dread, knowing that finding answers might mean confirming that Clara had died alone, far from everyone who loved her. The next 3 months were excruciating, a painful limbo of waiting for DNA results while trying to decide what to tell my family about everything I had discovered. I finally sat down with my mother and showed her the old phone with my grandmother's message, watching her face crumble as she listened to words her own mother had never felt safe enough to speak out loud. My mother cried for hours that day, grieving not just for the aunt she never knew existed, but for all the pain her mother had carried in silence, for all the ways that buried trauma had shaped their relationship without either of them understanding why. She told me stories I had never heard before about my grandmother's depression, her emotional unavailability, the way she would sometimes stare out windows as if searching for something lost. Suddenly, all of those behaviors made perfect sense, pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place to reveal the full picture of a woman haunted by loss and guilt. My mother and I decided together that we needed to visit my grandmother at the care facility and tell her what I had discovered, even though her dementia meant she might not fully understand or remember the conversation. When we arrived at her room, she was having one of her clearer days, recognizing us immediately and smiling with genuine warmth. I held her hand and gently told her that I had found the phone, that I knew about Clara, and that I was doing everything possible to find out what happened to her sister. My grandmother's eyes filled with tears, and she squeezed my hand with surprising strength, saying over and over, "Thank you. Thank you for not forgetting her." I tried so hard to find her, but I failed. I failed my sister. Watching my grandmother finally release decades of buried grief was one of the most heartbreaking and beautiful moments of my life, proof that even when our minds start to fade, our hearts remember the people and the pain we've carried. In those months of waiting, I also went back through all of my grandmother's belongings, finding hidden treasures I had missed before. Letters from Clara carefully preserved in a locked box, photographs tucked into book pages, a journal where my grandmother had documented every attempt she made to find her sister over the years. Reading those journal entries was like watching someone slowly drown in guilt and sorrow, each failed search deepening her conviction that she should have done more, fought harder, refused to let her parents erase Clara from existence. I realized that my grandmother had been living 2 lives. The public one where she pretended Clara never existed to keep peace with her family, and the private one where she mourned and searched and hoped for a miracle that never came. The weight of that double life, that constant betrayal of her own heart, had slowly crushed her spirit until she became the distant, sad woman I had known as a child. On a cold Tuesday morning in February, Detective Morrison called me with news that made my heart stop. They had found a match in the database. In 1988, about 8 months after Clara disappeared, a woman's remains had been found in a wooded area near Boise, Idaho, approximately 380 miles from where Clara's car was abandoned. The remains had been too decomposed to identify at the time, and without missing persons reports filed in that jurisdiction or any identifying information, Jane Doe number 47 had been buried in an unmarked grave in a local cemetery. The DNA comparison confirmed with 99.9% certainty that Jane Doe 47 was Clara Whitmore Thompson, my grandmother's lost sister, finally identified after 38 years of being nameless and forgotten. Morrison's voice was gentle as he explained that the medical examiner's original report indicated no signs of foul play, that Clara had likely died from exposure during a particularly harsh early winter storm that had swept through the area. I sat on my kitchen floor and sobbed for an hour after that phone call, mourning an aunt I never got to meet, grieving for my grandmother who spent her whole life searching for answers that came too late, crying for all the wasted years of silence and secrets that kept our family fractured and broken. But mixed with the grief was also a strange sense of relief, because finally, after all these years, we knew what happened to Clara. She hadn't been murdered by her husband. She hadn't abandoned everyone without a thought. She had been trying to start over, to find her way back to something better, and tragedy had struck in the form of nature's indifference. Morrison explained that based on where her remains were found and the timeline, it appeared Clara had left the rest stop with someone, possibly hitchhiking or accepting a ride, and had somehow ended up stranded in those woods when the storm hit. It was a senseless, random tragedy, the kind that happens every day and destroys families without any villain to blame or justice to seek. The authorities in Idaho agreed to release Clara's remains to our family, and I began planning something that seemed impossible just months ago, bringing Clara home and giving her a proper burial next to the parents who had disowned her, finally reuniting our family in death even though they couldn't manage it in life. I visited James Thompson one more time to tell him what we had discovered, and watching his face as he learned that Clara really had driven away that night, that he hadn't been lying all these years, was one of the most powerful moments of my entire journey. He wept like a child, saying, I told the truth, over and over. And I realized that even though he had been far from a perfect husband, he too had been a victim of this tragedy, spending 38 years under a cloud of suspicion for something he didn't do. Sometimes life doesn't give us clear villains or heroes. Sometimes it just gives us flawed people doing their best in impossible situations and tragedies that no one could have prevented. Over the next few weeks, I worked with a funeral home to arrange for Clara's remains to be transported back to our hometown and began planning a memorial service that would finally acknowledge her existence and honor her memory. The hardest part was deciding what to put on her headstone, how to summarize a life that had been erased and a death that had gone unnoticed for nearly 4 decades. I finally settled on something simple but powerful. Clara Margaret Whitmore Thompson, 1962-1987, beloved sister and daughter, finally home. My mother and I also decided to hold a small gathering before the burial, where family members could share memories and stories, creating space for the grief and acknowledgement that should have happened 38 years ago. We invited Dorothy, who had kept Clara's memory alive when no one else would, and surprisingly, we also invited James Thompson, who deserved to say goodbye to the woman he loved, even if he hadn't known how to love her properly. The memorial service was held on a sunny Saturday in March, and about 20 people showed up, including some distant relatives who remembered Clara from before the family erased her. Dorothy brought the old photographs my grandmother had entrusted to her, and we set up a small display showing Clara at different stages of her short life. A laughing teenager, a hopeful young woman in love, someone full of dreams and possibilities. My mother spoke about the aunt she never got to meet and the price our family paid for choosing pride over love, for valuing reputation more than relationships. She talked about how secrets poison families from the inside out, creating distance and pain that gets passed down through generations until someone finally has the courage to bring truth into the light. Her words were raw and honest, and I watched several relatives wipe away tears as they confronted their own complicity in Clara's erasure. When it was my turn to speak, I talked about finding that old phone and hearing my grandmother's message, about how that discovery sent me on a journey that changed everything I understood about my family and myself. I explained that Clara's story wasn't just about one woman who disappeared. It was about all the ways families hurt each other through silence, judgment, and conditional love. I said that maybe the greatest gift Clara could give us now was the lesson that it's never too late to choose connection over pride, forgiveness over grudges, and truth over comfortable lies. I looked out at the faces of my relatives, some of whom had been there when the decision was made to erase Clara, and I challenged them to think about what other secrets and silences might be damaging our family right now. What other relationships could be healed if we just had the courage to be honest and vulnerable with each other. The most emotional part of the day came when we brought my grandmother from the care facility to the cemetery for the burial. She had been having more bad days than good recently, her dementia progressing rapidly, as if her body knew its work was finally done and it was time to let go. We weren't sure if she would understand what was happening, but when we wheeled her to the gravesite and she saw Clara's name on the headstone, something shifted in her eyes. She reached out her hand toward the casket and whispered, "Clara, my baby sister Clara, I'm so sorry I couldn't save you. I'm so sorry I let them make me pretend you didn't exist." My mother and I knelt beside her wheelchair, holding her as she cried tears that had been building for 38 years, watching this woman we loved finally release the burden she had carried in silence for so long. My grandmother looked at me then with sudden clarity, her eyes focusing in a way they hadn't in months, and she said something I will never forget. "You did what I couldn't do. You brought her home. You refused to let her be forgotten. Thank you for being braver than I was, for having the courage I should have had when it mattered." Those words broke something open in my chest, because I realized that this whole journey hadn't just been about finding Clara. It had been about healing my grandmother's wounded heart, about giving her permission to finally stop carrying guilt for choices that were made by people who valued the wrong things. In that moment, standing in the cemetery with 3 generations of women who had all been damaged by the same family secret, I felt the weight of that inherited trauma finally begin to lift, replaced by something lighter and more hopeful. We buried Clara that day with full acknowledgement of who she was and what she meant to our family. No longer a shameful secret, but a beloved member whose loss we finally allowed ourselves to mourn. James Thompson stood at a respectful distance during the service, and afterward, I watched him approach the grave and place a single white rose on the fresh earth, his lips moving in what looked like a prayer or perhaps a final apology. My grandmother passed away peacefully in her sleep 3 weeks later, and I like to think that she finally felt free to go, knowing that Clara had been found and honored, that the wrong had been made as right as it could be after all these years. We buried my grandmother next to Clara, reuniting the sisters in death just as my grandmother had always hoped, their headstones standing side by side as permanent proof that they existed, that they mattered, and that they were loved. In the months following the burial, something remarkable happened in our family. People started talking. Relatives who had been distant for years began reaching out, sharing their own stories of pain and secrets, acknowledging the ways our family's culture of silence had damaged all of us. My mother's relationship with her siblings improved dramatically as they worked through their shared grief over their mother's hidden suffering and their own childhoods marked by emotional distance they had never understood. Cousins I barely knew contacted me to thank me for uncovering the truth, saying it helped them make sense of their own family dynamics and gave them courage to address secrets in their own lives. It was like Clara's story had cracked open something that had been sealed shut for generations, allowing light and air and healing to finally reach wounds that had been festering in darkness. My own life changed profoundly through this experience in ways I'm still discovering. The emotional distance I had always struggled with, that fear of real intimacy and connection, started to make sense as an inherited pattern rather than a personal failing. Understanding where it came from gave me power to choose differently, to consciously work on building authentic relationships, instead of repeating the cycle of emotional unavailability that had defined my family for so long. I started therapy to process not just this experience, but all the ways inherited trauma had shaped my life without my awareness, and that work has been transformative. I reconnected with friends I had pushed away, opened up to my partner in ways I never had before, and began living with a vulnerability and authenticity that would have terrified me before I found that old phone in my grandmother's attic. I also gained a deeper understanding of forgiveness and the complexity of human behavior. It would have been easy to villainize my great-grandparents for their decision to erase Clara, to paint them as monsters who destroyed their daughter's life. But the truth is more complicated. They were products of their time and culture, people who valued reputation and social standing above individual happiness, who genuinely believed they were protecting their family by maintaining appearances. Their choices were wrong and caused immeasurable damage, but they were also human beings doing what they thought was right with the understanding they had. Learning to hold both of those truths simultaneously, to acknowledge harm without dehumanizing the people who caused it, has been one of the most important lessons of this entire journey. Through this entire experience, I learned that family secrets are like poison that seeps into the groundwater, contaminating everything even when you can't see or taste it directly. The decision to erase Clara didn't just affect my grandmother and her parents. It created ripples that touched every relationship in our family for 2 generations. My mother's difficulty with emotional intimacy, my own struggles with connection and trust, the general atmosphere of tension and unspoken pain that hung over every family gathering, all of it traced back to that original wound that was never allowed to heal because no one was allowed to acknowledge it existed. Secrets don't protect families the way people think they do. They just spread the damage wider and deeper, infecting new relationships and creating patterns that repeat until someone finally breaks the cycle by bringing truth into the light. What shocked me most was discovering how many other families carry similar secrets, hidden tragedies, and shameful stories that get buried instead of processed. After I started sharing Clara's story publicly, dozens of people reached out to tell me about their own family mysteries. Siblings who disappeared and were never mentioned again, children given up for adoption and erased from family history, relatives who died under suspicious circumstances that no one ever investigated. Each story followed the same pattern of silence, creating more damage than the original event, of families fragmenting under the weight of what couldn't be said. It made me realize that this isn't just my family's dysfunction, it's a widespread cultural problem, the way we've been taught to hide pain instead of healing it, to prioritize appearances over authenticity, to choose comfortable lies over difficult truths. I also learned that seeking truth isn't always about finding justice or getting closure in the way we imagine it. When I started this journey, part of me hoped I would discover that Clara was still alive somewhere, living a happy life, and we could have this beautiful reunion that would fix everything. Or alternatively, I hoped I would find clear evidence of a crime that could finally be prosecuted, giving us justice and vindication. But real life rarely offers such clean resolutions. What I found instead was a tragic accident, a young woman trying to escape one difficult situation who encountered an even worse one, and a family that spent 38 years living with consequences of their own choices. The closure came not from the specific answers, but from the act of searching, from refusing to accept silence, from insisting that Clara's life and death mattered enough to be acknowledged and honored. One of the most powerful realizations I had during this journey was understanding how trauma and dysfunction get passed down through families like genetic inheritance, shaping who we become without us even knowing it. My grandmother's unprocessed grief over losing Clara turned into emotional unavailability that affected how she parented my mother. My mother, growing up with a distant and depressed mother without understanding why, developed her own attachment issues and difficulty with vulnerability. I inherited those same patterns, feeling disconnected and struggling with intimacy, never knowing that I was carrying the weight of a family secret that predated my birth by decades. It's terrifying how much of what we think is our personal psychology is actually inherited trauma, playing out through our lives like a script we never agreed to follow. But here's the hopeful part that I need you to really hear. These patterns can be broken, these cycles can end, but only if someone has the courage to bring awareness to them and consciously choose differently. By uncovering Clara's story and understanding how it shaped my family, I gained the power to make different choices in my own life. I can recognize when I'm starting to withdraw emotionally and ask myself if that's really what I want or if it's just an old pattern trying to repeat itself. I can choose vulnerability even when it feels dangerous because I understand that the alternative, the silence and distance that seemed safe to previous generations, actually causes more harm in the long run. Breaking generational patterns isn't easy, and it doesn't happen overnight, but it's absolutely possible when you shine light on the darkness and refuse to keep passing the poison down to the next generation. I think about the children I might have someday and what kind of family legacy I want to give them. Do I want to pass down the silence and secrets and emotional distance that characterized my family for so long? Or do I want to create a new legacy of openness, vulnerability, and the courage to face difficult truths? By finding Clara and bringing her story into the light, I've already started creating that new legacy. My future children will know about their great-great-aunt Clara, not as a shameful secret, but as a real person whose life mattered, and whose loss taught our family important lessons about love, forgiveness, and the cost of choosing pride over connection. They'll grow up knowing that in our family, we don't erase people when they make choices we don't understand, we don't hide pain instead of healing it, and we don't let fear keep us from telling the truth. Standing here now, almost a year after finding that old phone in my grandmother's attic, I can see how profoundly that discovery changed the entire trajectory of my life and my family's future. What started as a simple curiosity about an outdated piece of technology turned into a journey of healing that spanned 4 decades and 3 generations. I found more than just answers about what happened to Clara. I found understanding about why my family was the way it was, compassion for the people who made painful choices, and most importantly, I found the power to choose differently for myself and for the generations that will come after me. Clara's story didn't have the happy ending I hoped for, but it gave our family something we desperately needed: truth, acknowledgement, and permission to finally grieve what was lost. The experience taught me that healing isn't about fixing everything or making the past different than it was. It's about bringing light to the darkness, speaking truth about what happened, and choosing to learn and grow from pain instead of letting it poison you. My grandmother carried her secret and her guilt for 60 years, and it slowly destroyed her from the inside out, stealing her joy and her ability to fully connect with the people who loved her. I refuse to make that same choice. When something painful or difficult happens in my life now, I talk about it, I process it, I seek help and support, instead of burying it and pretending everything is fine. I've learned that vulnerability isn't weakness. It's actually the greatest strength we have, the only real path to authentic connection and healing. After hearing my story, I want you to think about your own family and the secrets that might be hiding in your history. What stories have been erased or silenced? What pain has been passed down through generations, without anyone understanding where it came from? What would it mean for your healing and your family's future if someone finally had the courage to bring truth into the light? I'm not saying everyone needs to go on a quest to solve decades-old mysteries, but I am saying that awareness is the first step toward change. And sometimes the most radical thing we can do is simply refuse to participate in the silence that keeps families broken and disconnected. If you want more stories like this, real accounts of family healing and breaking generational patterns. Make sure to subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications because these conversations matter, and your story matters too.